It goes without saying that one of the most cherished children's movies in the history of cinema is the 1939 musical The Wizard of Oz. Many generations grew up with it and claim it to be a magical part of their childhoods. What with its fairy tale storytelling, bright colours and singing munchkins, The Wizard of Oz is truly a testament that shines bright in the art of cinema. In 1985, a follow-up sequel was released called Return to Oz. Yes, 46 years later, parents who grew up with The Wizard of Oz can now take their children and grandchildren to a movie theatre to see a brand new Oz adventure. No doubt this will be just as magical as the first one, with more warm, heartfelt moments. However, what they got was this. Yeah, Return to Oz wasn't so much a whimsical fairy tale, but more like a disturbing nightmare. In other words, not so much a children's adventure, but more of a children's horror movie.
Yeah, kids under 6 are going to get nightmares from this picture.
Should have spelled magic, but this dark, sometimes dreary movie just spells disappointment to me.
Did a lot of kids in the audience scream?
No.
They did when I was there. They were really, really upset.
Needless to say, many parents and critics were shocked with this darker, melancholy interpretation of the Oz universe, and felt that this was blasphemous to the Wizard of Oz and their memories they had with the movie, with this new movie being considered too intense, bleak, creepy, and downright frightening for children. And so it got panned by critics, and would only make $11 million in the box office on its $28 million budget, making it a flop. Despite this though, it does seem that many of the kids who watched it did actually love it. They didn't have the decades of adoration of The Wizard of Oz to compare it to, where thanks to home media and TV broadcasts of Return to Oz, this underappreciated dark fantasy has gone on to be considered a cult classic, and is now pretty much considered just as important as The Wizard of Oz. So now Return to Oz has cemented itself as a beloved, powerful children's movie. What about the lost version of this movie? Scenes that could have given us a different experience. Which leads to many questions like, why does Aunt Em paint Dorothy's face with imaginary paint? And could Ozma actually be dead? Yeah, it'll make sense as we go along. Well, today we are going to find out as we explore the version of Return to Oz that you've never seen. So get ready as we return to this movie that scared so many of us in our childhoods. Thankfully, I have my courage here. I don't know if you can see that. So now that I have the Noiv, let's check it out. Buckle up, Bellina. We have to return to Oz.
Oh, this guy's an idiot.
So not only are there alternative scenes that didn't make it into Return to Oz, but an entirely deleted movie, one that dates back to 1957, 28 years before the release of Return to Oz. Okay, so here's what happened. In 1939, movie studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer produced The Wizard of Oz. And, well, that too didn't have the most glowing theatrical release, and if you can believe it, actually didn't make as much as anticipated. But despite this, for its time, it was an unrealized masterpiece, and in the following years, thanks to re-releases, it would go on to be considered a timeless classic, where it would get the status that it has today. The Wizard of Oz was based on the first Oz book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was written by L. Frank Baum in 1900, which would lead to a further 14 books, where Baum would continue to write the books, but come 1919, Baum would pass away. And so, 20 years later after his death, his vision would become fully realised on the big screen with The Wizard of Oz. Jump to 1954, 15 years after the release of the MGM Wizard of Oz, at a time when its popularity was really starting to take off, Walt Disney bought the rights to the remaining Oz books. It was his intention to make live-action Oz adventures for the small screen in the Disney anthology series Disneyland, which would evolve into the wonderful world of Disney. So now under Disney, the plan was to make a double-episode adaptation of the book The Patchwork Girl of Oz. However, as the production of these TV specials went forward, it was felt the production had become very ambitious and was starting to more resemble a large-scale movie. So plans for making episodes for TV were scrapped, and it was decided to turn this idea into a big feature film. And in 1957, the production evolved into The Rainbow Road to Oz. And Walt Disney himself even took part in a promotional presentation of the movie. Now, The Rainbow Road to Oz is considered an abandoned film, one that was never completed, and it's not made clear just how much of the movie had been developed. Now, costumes and sets had been put together, as well as some musical numbers being written. There are two reasons given to The Rainbow Road to Oz being cancelled. One was over concerns of the increasing costs of making the movie, the other being the fact that the movie was to feature the Mouseketeers, a 1950s version of the Mickey Mouse Club. And although these kids would feature in the Disneyland show, it was believed that they didn't have the clout to carry a major event feature film. But either way, The Rainbow Road to Oz was no more, and the man behind the project, Walt Disney himself, would pass away 9 years later in 1966. Despite this though, the world of Oz was now in the hands of Disney Studios, and thus is an important chapter when it comes to the eventual creation of Return to Oz. Now, in between that time, the Oz brand wasn't entirely dormant. In 1964, there was an animated TV special produced by Crawley Films called, get this, Return to Oz. Yeah, the exact same name as the movie that we're talking about today. Then in 1972, Filmation produced an animated sequel called Journey Back to Oz, which, like Return to Oz, would feature Jack Pumpkinhead and Mombi, and Judy Garland's daughter, Liza Minnelli, would voice Dorothy, and Margaret Hamilton would return. Interestingly, not to play the Wicked Witch, but Auntie Em. Okay, that's interesting. Finally, in 1978, The Wiz was released, a new take on the Wizard of Oz tale, based on a musical stage show featuring an all-African-American cast, including Diana Ross, Michael Jackson, and Richard Pryor. It's here we get to filmmaker Walter Murch. Up at that time, he had worked on the sound design and editing of several popular movies, being a frequent collaborator with George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola. Some of the movies he had worked on include THX 1138, The Godfather, American Graffiti, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now, with him being part of some truly successful movies of the 70s. Walter Murch approached Disney Productions chief, Tom Wilhite, about his ideas of making a new movie about the fictional world of Oz, one that was a sequel based on some of the follow-up Oz stories. In other words, Return to Oz. Return to Oz was something of a passion project for Murch, and was to see him leave the confines of editing and sound design and leap into script writing and directing. And it just so happened that Disney owned the rights to the follow-up Oz books, because of the as-mentioned failed project, The Rainbow Road to Oz. And nor would they need any kind of approval from MGM, as by the time the movie came out, the Oz stories would have been in public domain. So due to copyright being on their side, the production went forward, with Murch writing the script with fellow scriptwriter Gil Dennis. And despite Tom Wilhite, who gave the production the go-ahead, leaving the Disney company, the new chief, Richard Berger, would actually increase the budget from $20 million to $28 million. So clearly there was great faith in the movie. Not only that, but Return to Oz would be produced by Gary Kurtz, who previously produced Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, and had also previously worked with Murch on American Graffiti. So the big question is, what would this new movie be exactly? In the script's early days, the movie was simply called Oz. Yeah, just Oz. And Murch based his script on the second and third Oz books, The Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz. The Marvelous Land of Oz didn't feature Dorothy, but a boy called Tip, but it did introduce Ozma, Jack Pumpkinhead, Gump, and the concept of the Deadly Desert. Ozma of Oz, on the other hand, has a very similar story to Return to Oz, in which after a storm, Dorothy and a chicken called Billina find themselves in the land of Ev, a country outside of Oz, where they must avoid the terrifying Wheelers, team up with a clockwork robot called Tick-Tock, come face to face with an evil princess who has a collection of detachable heads. In this case it wasn't Mombi, but a character called Princess Langwidere. And of course they must confront the evil and powerful Gnome King. With the script of Return to Oz being a mishmash of the second and third books, thus making it a sequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, does, theatrically speaking, kind of make it a sequel to the 1939 movie. Despite this though, the production did not want Return to Oz to be a sequel to the 1939 movie. They wanted to create a world that was truer to the books, and for Return to Oz to in no way resemble MGM's Wizard of Oz. So in other words, yes, it's a follow-up story, but it's also its own entirely new film with its own universe. But that wasn't entirely true either, as Return to Oz featured the Ruby Slippers, a concept purely made for the 1939 movie. As in the books, Dorothy's magical footwear were silver shoes. I guess it was felt that the ruby slippers were too iconic, and that if people saw Dorothy wearing silver shoes, they might be a bit confused. And so Disney decided to incorporate the ruby slippers, and in order to do so, they had to pay a fee to MGM, as the ruby slippers were an original concept created by MGM. Another connection between The Wizard of Oz and Return to Oz is the concept of people in the real world, aka Kansas, also representing people in Oz, which once again was a concept that was introduced in The Wizard of Oz and would continue to be used in Return to Oz. Murch wanted the world of Return to Oz to look dark and strange, a scary fantasy world with no musical numbers. As when his mother read the book to him as a child, he found concepts like Mombi with her swapping heads to actually be quite frightening. It was this strangeness that attracted Murch to the Oz books. And yeah, you know what, when you think about it, a character who has a pumpkin for a head and Mombi and the Wheelers are actually quite freaky, and does actually go into territories of body horror. So maybe at the time, Return to Oz's biggest crime is that maybe it was just too faithful to the original books and didn't sugarcoat it with bright colourful sets and singing munchkins. It was also decided with Dorothy Gale to actually cast a 9-year-old child, as the character was in the book, as opposed to The Wizard of Oz, which cast a teenage Judy Garland in the part. Fairuza Balk was chosen out of 600 potential Dorothys, and they really struck gold with her. Balk's acting is top tier in Return to Oz. Despite all the craziness going on around her, you fully believe her, and she does have lots of heart and empathy. Whenever I used to watch Return to Oz as a kid, I always used to get worried and stressed for Dorothy, and really wanted her to be okay. And as Dorothy is in 98% of the movie, they really had to get the casting right, and thankfully they did. Heck, even Paul McCartney thought she made a great Dorothy, so you know you've made it when you're now pals with a Beatle. The shoot was intended to be filmed in Algeria and Italy, but due to budgetary reasons, the filming took place entirely in England, namely Elstree Studios and Salisbury Plain, to which at that particular location, the cast and crew really suffered with the cold, to which Fairuza Balk cried from just how cold and painful it was. And in addition to that, during the shoot, there were other issues, like the movie's original cameraman leaving due to a rocky working relationship with Murch, as well as the shoot really falling behind schedule, and Murch's health really starting to take its toll, with him at the time looking really unwell. Disney weren't happy with the footage that was coming back, and the fact that Murch looked so sick, so he was fired. Murch at that moment was so worn out from it all, he actually felt relief. However, George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola came to Murch's rescue and convinced Disney to rehire Murch. And Lucas even said that if they still weren't happy with Murch after they rehire him, then he himself will take over directing duties. And so, I guess Disney had the common sense to listen to the masterminds behind The Godfather and Star Wars. And so Murch was rehired, and thankfully he did manage to complete the shoot. Return to Oz was released in June the 21st, 1985, and people were shocked with just how morbid and scary the movie was. What they got was a movie where Dorothy is depressed and is sent to an asylum to get electric shock treatment, where she then arrives at a run-down apocalyptic Oz, gets terrorized by a witch with a collection of removable heads, and must play a deadly game in which she must choose the right ornament or become an ornament herself. Yep, child endangerment. Not to mention, of course, the Wheelers. Weird, manic guys with wheels for their hands and feet, which no doubt has given many traumatized kids nightmares. And finally, a confrontation with the Gnome King, where Oz literally looks like hell. Yeah, I don't think parents were in a hurry to get their children the Return to Oz read-along storybook, or those weird Return to Oz dolls. So it's here we get to the deleted scenes that didn't make it into the final cut. Let's explore some of these scenes that stood out to me the most. At the start of the movie, we see Dorothy laying in bed, unable to sleep because of her first trip to Oz. In the original work print of the movie, when Auntie Em visits Dorothy, she asks Dorothy if she would like her to paint her face, where she pretends to paint Dorothy's face, saying all the imaginary colours that she is using to paint Dorothy's face with. I guess this was a calming, soothing thing that Auntie Em does with Dorothy, and it actually makes Auntie Em warmer and more loving, unlike the final film where she's like, "You have to sleep, we have to build this farm." We do see more of the farm, where the family has kept a newspaper clipping about Dorothy surviving the tornado, while Uncle Henry sits in the middle of the unfinished house with his injured leg, appearing defeated while wrapped up in a blanket, and is also unresponsive to Dorothy when she says hello to him, suggesting that like Dorothy, he too is in a depression, and that the whole ordeal with the tornado has actually really taken its toll on the entire family, hence the melancholy atmosphere.
Henry used to take second place for nobody. Now it just sits.
When Dorothy and Em arrive at Dr. Worley's facility, he refers to Dorothy as Dotty. But this may not just be an accident, as Dotty is an Old English slang for being slightly mad. You know, a little bit insane. Hence Auntie Em's very quick correction.
And, you must be Dotty.
Dorothy.
Ah, Dorothy. Yeah.
When the power outage occurs, we hear more horrific screams from the other patients.
Would you see to that, please?
When Dorothy shuts herself away from the Wheelers, we see two Wheelers stay behind to keep guard, where they oddly lay down. I guess this suggests that when the Wheelers are still and not moving around, they have to lay down, probably because their hands and feet are wheels. I don't know what it is, but to me that is actually kind of creepy. There's some extra dialogue when Mombi locks Dorothy in the tower.
Dorothy Gale from Kansas.
After the Wheelers fail to capture Dorothy and Billina, after Dorothy and her friends escape, we see Mombi angrily whip them as they prepare to travel to the Gnome King. And yeah, it actually shows how mean and vicious Mombi is. I never thought I'd actually feel bad for the Wheelers, but here we are. In the end, when the Gnome King is defeated, the scene where Dorothy retrieves the ruby slippers from the ruins of the Gnome King didn't feel so rushed, but it was actually longer and just felt more triumphant. Like this was a big, grand, epic moment of Dorothy finally getting back the ruby slippers. Unlike the theatrical movie where the moment doesn't really get to be savoured because everything was just so hectic. Also, the original voice acting in this rough cut sounds kind of off. Like you can tell it's the characters, and their voices do sound kind of similar, but at the same time their voices hadn't been fully realised yet.
It is curious the way the sky's underneath the land in this part of the country.
The Wheeler say something about the Gnome King not liking chickens?
That was a novel experience, wasn't it?
Oh, thank you, Dorothy.
And if you think they sound weird, just listen to the Tin Man, who sounds like he's just walked off the set of a Guy Ritchie gangster movie.
Me?
Yes, be the Queen of Oz.
Yeah, go blimey, Gov, now be the Queen of Oz. So in the theatrical movie, we see the residents of Oz chant to Dorothy to be the Queen of Oz. But in this theatrical cut, it's actually really brief. Originally, it was longer. The idea of Dorothy being the Queen of Oz actually came to be because Scarecrow confessed that he didn't really want to be king and be ruler of Oz.
What's the matter?
I never wanted to be king, Dorothy. I have the brains for it.
but not the heart. Stay here, Dorothy. I'll roll over us.
And despite the glowing pleas from the Oz residents, Dorothy decides to not be the Queen of Oz, as she must go back to Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, whom she admits would be worried about her. Which leads to the scene where Ozma appears and takes her throne over Oz, where in this original cut, the inhabitants of Oz start chanting Ozma's name.
Queen of Oz!
And so Dorothy is sent back to Kansas. So it's here we get to the deleted scene which stands out to me the most. When Dorothy is discovered by Henry and Em. There's a cut scene where a police officer turns up and asks Em and Henry if they found the other one.
Any sign of the other one?
No. Half the party's gone further on downriver. They're still looking.
God willing they find her too, poor thing.
Amen.
Okay, so this other one who is missing is clearly the little blonde girl from the clinic. But here's the thing, I always assumed that that little girl was Ozma. After all, when we see her at the asylum, she seems to know exactly who Dorothy is. And she also seems to have a supernatural presence, almost like a ghost, as she can randomly appear and then disappear, and even manifest in mirrors and reflections. Much how Ozma is trapped in the mirror in the land of Oz. That, and when Dorothy sees Ozma at the end, she says,
I was afraid you would drown.
As in when the little girl at the asylum helped to save Dorothy in the river, where it does indeed appear that she drowned. So that bit of dialogue right there does connect Ozma to the little girl at the asylum, clearly insinuating that they're the same person. So yeah, I always thought that this girl was Ozma, and that Ozma is somehow able to project herself in Dorothy's Kansas existence. But from what the police officer was saying, the missing girl from the asylum is a little girl from this reality. Okay, so maybe Nurse Wilson told the authorities another little girl escaped with Dorothy, and that's why there's a search party for her. But if this is Ozma, that still doesn't explain why when we see her at the clinic, she is wearing different attire that is more suited to that time and location. And in the script, when she's at the facility, she is simply referred to as Girl. Another way to look at this is that Ozma is a reflection of the little girl at the hospital, like how the Gnome King is a representation of Dr. Wally, and Mombi is a representation of Nurse Wilson. So this begs to ask, who is the little girl at the hospital? Another patient? Maybe. If this girl isn't Ozma, did she actually drown and die? So I went back to the original script to see if there was anything I can find. And I did. In the final scene at the farm, Auntie Em is talking to Dorothy in her new room. She tells her that when she got back to the farm after leaving Dorothy at the clinic, both her and Henry felt bad about it. So they both immediately headed back to get Dorothy, and arrived just as the storm occurred. That's why Em and Henry were in the search party to begin with. That's why they were able to be there so quickly. Aunt Em then mentions that it's a shame about the other little girl, and asks Dorothy, what was her name again? When Dorothy then sees her in the mirror, and replies, Ozma. But Em is confused by Dorothy's reply. Em then adds that Dr. Wally had people locked up in his basement whom had been damaged by his machines, which is no doubt why Nurse Wilson was being arrested. Interestingly, the exact same piece of dialogue is said by the little girl in the hospital earlier in the film when she helps Dorothy escape.
What's that screaming? Their patients have been damaged, locked in the cellar.
So Dr. Wally's facility truly is a house of horrors. So does this mean the little girl was imprisoned by Dr. Wally, and she was one of the patients who was, quote, damaged by one of his machines? Was she a kid sent there by her own guardians for also having an overactive imagination, trapped and imprisoned, very much in the same way her Ozma counterpart was? Well, okay, so there are two ways you can look at this. If you see the Land of Oz as 100% being a real place, then the little girl in the hospital is Ozma, and thus she made it back to Oz and lives on. But if you see Oz as a product of Dorothy's imagination, then as grim as it is, the little girl in the hospital did drown and die trying to save Dorothy. But to Dorothy, she lives on as she sees her as Ozma, the queen of her own fantasy world. Damn, that really is quite grim. It kind of reminds me of the fate of the little girl in Pan's Labyrinth, where you don't know if she died or lived on in a fairy tale world. What's fascinating is that Dr. Wally is a villainous character. He appears kind and charming and even caring, but behind that appeal, he did do evil, terrible things and was something of an evil, mad doctor who caused harm and hurt people and kept them locked up as not to reveal that his technology and methods don't work and that he is a charlatan. This was a man who hated imagination and dreams and saw them as weakness. And thanks to the newfound wonders of electricity, the world was now turning into a more technical-minded reality, describing dreams and imagination as useless excess currents of dreams and delusions. In other words, he wanted to take away people's imaginations and individuality, but in trying to kill the human spirit, he did more harm than good. And there's an irony that he wanted to wipe Dorothy's imagination out of her head, and yet he was trying to get her to use her imagination to convince her that his machine is harmless and has a face. So, on one part, he doesn't want her imagination, but in order to believe him, he wants her to have an imagination. I guess an imagination when it suits his motives. So his logic is really flawed. To which he himself died in the fire, whilst trying to save these machines. And his wolf in sheep's clothing persona is actually mimicked with the Gnome King, who was also originally shown to have a kind and compassionate side. But we also see that that is also an illusion. It's kind of a reversal of the wizard from The Wizard of Oz, who was shown to be a big, powerful, menacing presence, but behind the curtain he was a harmless little man. Well, Wally is the exact opposite. He is shown to be harmless and of no threat, but behind that persona, he was actually a larger-than-life, villainous monster. The irony is, without imagination and dreams, Oz can't exist. But if Oz didn't exist, then Dorothy wouldn't be at Dr. Wally's facility at the first place. So no matter how much you try, you can't kill hopes and dreams. Otherwise you descend into cruelty and create a bleak, destructive world. A world very similar to the apocalyptic Oz that we see in the movie. Regardless, Return to Oz is a classic movie, and I'm content with the cut that we got, as it doesn't overcomplicate things. It's funny because we always talk about how scary and disturbing Return to Oz is, but it's actually a very positive movie, with a very positive message, that being you can't take away or destroy imagination or the human spirit. Yeah, Return to Oz is more of a children's horror movie. And I think at the time, people were like, now how could you do that to our beloved Wizard of Oz? That's Ma and Pa's apple pie! But, despite all that, the kids did seem to love it. And personally, I really love the atmosphere and artistic style of Return to Oz. And in general, I really love this movie. It's actually one of my favourite movies ever. Also, I really do think it's a shame that Walter Murch never directed another movie, almost like he was disheartened by the response that Return to Oz got. Because, going by Return to Oz, he was a good director. And I just hope that he now knows that people do love and adore his movie. Anyway, I'm Minty, and don't ever let anyone try and take away your dreams and imagination, as they are your greatest strength. See ya!